What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I am Jordan with Jared, and we have a special guest today, Dave from Answers and Reason. How's it going, Dave?
I'm not too bad. How's it going?
Going well. Dave's joining us all the way from sunny Wales.
Very sunny. I mean, it's all white, so, it's got to be sunny.
And today we're going to be talking about skepticism. Since this is a skepticism channel, I thought we should probably have an episode about, what is that? What does it mean to be a skeptic? How should you do it? And I'll be honest, I probably have not thought about what it means to be a skeptic and the various ways of being skeptical as much as I should, given that that's kind of my thing. So,
and it may turn out that we're not even true skeptics the way that we go about it. So,
Peronian skepticism would say you're not. So,
yeah. Well, there you go. So, before we dive in, Dave, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
I'm Dave. I'm one of those annoying philosophy kind of people who generally tends to make everything far more complicated than it needs to be and really boring. I stream with Joe on Answers and Reason, we've taken a break for a while because I've had a few health issues, but we're probably going to be streaming again soon. So, and I'm doing a computer degree as well.
Oh, wow. Man, you just can't stay out of school, can you?
No, I got nothing better to do.
Yeah. Well, I could say if you all aren't familiar with Answers and Reason yet, I highly recommend you go check their channel out. One of my favorite channels on the YouTubes. So
it's got a really high quality of information. So it's very highbrow. So
I think you're talking about a different channel.
I didn't. Well, the hosts aren't necessarily highbrow, but the information presenting it.
Yeah, that's better.
All right, Dave. So let's get into it. What does it mean to be skeptical? What does it mean to be a skeptic?
Okay, well, I'm probably going to alienate a lot of your audience now, because I'm going to say, just like being an atheist, there's more than one kind. And if you go back to ancient Greece, there's two schools of skepticism. And what we call skepticism now is very different. In ancient Greece, you had the academics and you had the Pyrrhonians. And back then, it was about whether knowledge was actually possible. The academics believed we could never have knowledge, and the Pyrrhonians thought they were being far too dogmatic. Because we should suspend judgment on whether knowledge is actually possible rather than declare that it's not possible.
And so, if my understanding is correct, that one school of thought, can we even have knowledge, basically meant that you were skeptical of all claims. You couldn't have.
You didn't assent to any kind of propositions. You didn't give belief to anything. Everything was, I don't know. And they believed that it brought you inner peace by saying that never assenting to anything, which probably didn't help when you walk into a wall.
Yeah, to anything?
Anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
That strikes me as maybe a little bit extreme.
Radical skepticism.
Right. So where did it go from there? Moving on from ancient Greece, how do we get to where we are now?
You kind of move forward then for quite a while until Descartes appears. And then Descartes comes along with his methodological doubt, which was basically the idea of doubting all of your beliefs, going through them all, and any belief that wasn't indubitable, you got rid of. So it's kind of extreme because he set the bar so high that no beliefs could actually match it. So you're essentially going back to radical skepticism, but looking for a foundation to build all your beliefs off of.
Right.
And of course, Descartes, the only thing he actually got down to was the cogito.
Yeah. Which is, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah. Right. Because if there's something doing the thinking, that thinking thing must exist. So to doubt that you were thinking means you're thinking, and it means you exist. So it's the only thing that you couldn't actually doubt.
Yeah, so you can't know anything except for this one thing that you can know. And then he
built everything up from that. Yeah. And he started with the whole doubting of the senses. You're probably used to something like that. You've probably dealt with pre-suppers. Our senses sometimes fail.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, they're horrible. And it's such bad argumentation, although it made sense in Descartes' example because he was trying to doubt anything, no matter how ridiculous the doubt. So if our senses sometimes fail us, then we can never trust our senses, because how do we know we're not dreaming? And you have the whole evil demon argument. And then he built up a foundation from that, which was that God exists. And God is not a trickster. God would do his best to make sure that you didn't have false beliefs, so therefore you weren't being tricked by an evil demon. It's a terrible argument, but it's a foundation to build everything from.
Yeah. I always found it funny when I'm thinking about Descartes, like the original idea for Descartes seems great. Like, let's challenge all of my previously held beliefs and look at them skeptically one by one. But it's funny that he came back and held all the same beliefs he looked at when he started.
That's it. He just grounded them a little bit differently. It's like, I'm going to doubt everything, but I'm so smart that everything I thought before was correct anyway. So,
Yeah. Man, what are the odds?
Yeah, who'd have thought? But this is actually something I kind of wish more skeptics today would kind of look at, because I think Descartes, like you said, it's a great idea, doubting all of your beliefs and going through and checking all the justifications and rationalizations, because that's what his whole idea was, to see what was justified and what was just, well, so-and-so told me so. Or it's what everybody believes.
Yeah. There's definitely a tendency in humans, and atheists and skeptics aren't immune to this, to kind of, you take in knowledge, and once you've the knowledge is there, your brain's like, well, I know it, so it doesn't matter how I know it. It's, that's not important. And it kind of jettisons that part, so you end up with a bunch of things that how do I know it?
I'm just smart. I'm just smart. I'm smart. If I've thought it, therefore it must be right. So, well,
I'm an engineer, which makes me an expert in every field. So that's fortunate. Yeah.
I'm a philosopher. That makes me an expert in everything too.
And I'm a theologian, which makes me an expert in nothing. So,
all our bases
covered. The metaphysical grounding of everything in that case.
There you go.
You're in touch with the guy who designed it all.
Exactly. That's true. That's not true, actually.
No.
So one thing about Descartes is, what I think is important to point out too, is he also had this concept that all of your other beliefs interfered with one another too. So you really had to see how they interlocked like a spider web, right? So you really had to dig into it.
Yeah. And that's something that G. Moore kind of worked on later in the this century or last century. He kind of came up with that idea, the web of beliefs. And that's also something in psychology. Mm-hmm. Something called schematic processing is the way our brains process everything. Everything is all interlinked. So if you have something down at the bottom that is kind of faulty, it makes all the beliefs that follow from it faulty.
Which actually is part of the reason that I spend any time at all talking about theism and, religion, that sort of thing. Other than the fact that I've got to do something before I shuffle off my mortal coil. But while I don't go as far as I don't know, some people like Aaron Ra or Matt Dillahunty or Christopher Hitchens, where religion poisons everything, I think that if you start with faulty assumptions, then you can't help but come to faulty conclusions in some situations. Absolutely. That's not great, right?
Yeah.
So, so we're talking about doubt and how you can know things. So that touches on epistemology, right? The way that you can what it means to know things.
Yeah.
So how does that tie in?
Okay, epistemology is kind of a complicated subject. Most people are familiar with the idea of the justified true belief, and that is what knowledge is. But today, that's kind of frowned upon. Those are necessary components for knowledge, but they're not sufficient components for knowledge. There's even doubts whether belief is necessary for knowledge. I don't quite buy that one myself. I think it sounds a bit ridiculous to say, I know the sun is outside, but I don't believe the sun is outside.
Yeah, I don't know how you could know something but believe not that thing.
Somebody tells you something. So say you learn from school, 1 + 1 is 2. You don't believe it, but because your teacher told you, you accept it's probably true. you can have a spurious case like that. It sounds kind of forced and overcomplicated to me. I can't remember the woman's name, Carolyn Black, I think it is, who put that forward. But as far as I'm concerned, belief and knowledge are two things that are necessary components.
Well, I can give you an example, Jordan. You know God exists. You just don't believe it.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's true. Though James White told me that I do believe it. I'm just suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Yeah. That
deep down.
Going back to pre-suppers. That's I get told that a lot by pre-suppers.
Way deep down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it comes to like what I believe, they would know, right? They're obviously better informed on the subject than I am. So epistemology is complicated and a deep subject. We're not going to spend the whole time talking about epistemology, but for the purposes of like knowing whether you should know something, or do you think that it's good enough to go with the justified true belief definition as like a...
It's like if you can justify something, and this is where the complicated bits in, and this is why the academics and the Pyrrhonians said that knowledge could never be had, because justifications become difficult. You either led down a route of infinite regress of justifications, you're led down a route of circular arguments, or you find basically what Descartes does, you find a dogmatic foundation where you're just asserting something is true and you're building from that. But I do think it's fine as long as you're, for the average everyday person, you just need to have good enough justifications to say, well, all the scientists say this, so therefore I'm going with the scientists. They seem to know what they're talking about. I believe what the scientists say. That seems like you have knowledge of a particular subject. Not in-depth knowledge, but it's good enough to say you have knowledge, I would say.
Good enough to keep you from walking into walls and things like that.
Basically. I mean, if you believe gravity, you've seen balls fall 1 million times, that seems pretty good justification to not walk off the edge of a cliff and say, you don't want to die.
Right. And practically speaking, like, while there may be situations where that kind of mindset doesn't work, the person just living their life is unlikely to run into those situations regularly. That's
it. And I think David Hume said once that you can do all this, like go deep into the woods, be like the academics, be like the Pyrrhonians, but at the end of the day, you're going to leave your study and go back to playing backgammon, and none of it's going to matter to the guy you're playing backgammon with. And I think that's the case for most people. To say you know something is just to have good reasons to say you know it, it's true, and you believe it's true.
And that is... The thing about justification is important because it doesn't mean that we need to like have 100% certainty.
No.
Right?
And that's the other thing that goes back to the academics and the Pyrrhonians. They say you need to have 100% certainty. But today, infallibilism is the most common thing. And that's basically what science does. Something is true if we have good reason to believe it's true, and there is no actual counterfactuals that discard it as being true.
So basically, something is true if you have good reasons to think it's true and no insufficient reasons to think it's not true.
Yeah. And that seems like pretty good common sense.
Kind of just lightly hold your opinions on what's true and be willing to change it in the future.
Yeah, which is where the skepticism is important. If you hold on to it and you think you're infallible, you're probably not holding on to very good knowledge. I mean, I suppose you could say, like Descartes, that's an infallible thing, but today there's even arguments that that's fallible.
So go ahead, Jared.
We'll say real quick, like, I think it's important to distinguish between like skepticism and like the skeptical method, because I think like what Jordan and I do here is more of a supporting the skeptical method and stuff. Like, we're not true skeptics in the Pyrrhonian sense or even, but like we do hold to skepticism, but we're more proponents of like just applying the skeptical method to things.
Yeah.
Right.
And and that's probably the most important form of skepticism. it leads to what would be considered plain skepticism, which is what most people in the skeptic community is. We have a disposition to being skeptical. We have an evidential outlook. We doubt certain things. We might not go through all of our beliefs and doubt them like Descartes did, but I'm kind of doubtful that even he did that. Gotta be skeptical.
I mean, again, like we said, if you go through that process and end up with exactly the same beliefs at the end,
probably didn't do a good job. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I did that though. When I did my deconversion, I had like this crisis of like, well, what do I know? Like, so I kind of went through and I took like a stock of like the big important topics, right? Like I was like, all right, so maybe it doesn't matter if I understand that my mom and my dad actually exist or not, but morality, ethics, things like that really play a big role. So I'm going to look at those previously held beliefs, and the other stuff's just kind of like whatever.
As it comes up, it comes up. That's it. We all have sort of these big major outlooks on life, and our beliefs guide us. So the important thing is to look at the beliefs that guide us more than anything and make sure that they're on good foundations and they're guiding us in a reasonably good way. And I think that's what skepticism should be about.
So are there kind of developed methods of skepticism that we can look at that are popular today? Like,
it's just basically called critical thinking today. Yeah.
Don't be an idiot.
Yeah, basically. But it's kind of making sure that you're going to the right epistemic authorities. You're not allowing your biases to taint how you look at the information. You look at both sides. But that kind of thing. That's what being a good skeptic actually is. It's not, show me evidence. That's not evidence. Like you see that a lot online.
Yeah.
And it's understanding what evidence is and understanding the kind of evidence you're looking for. Like the streams you did recently with the Jesus mythicism, you get a lot of people who will say something like, well, nobody in Rome wrote about Jesus. That's pretty good evidence he didn't exist.
Which isn't true. But
Yeah, that's it. Why would that be good evidence he didn't exist? He was a preacher in the backwoods of nowhere. He didn't have an impact in Rome. So you're looking for the wrong evidence. Being a skeptic a good skeptic is looking for the right evidence.
When I hear that often, and I'm always like, what do you imagine a Roman aristocrat is doing? Because they're the ones writing books because they're the only ones who can write.
Yeah.
It's not everybody could do it. So a Roman aristocrat is like, oh, there's a apocalyptic like doomsday preacher in rural Galilee, thousands of miles away. I must immediately write this down.
It doesn't happen, And I mean, he was basically, I think what happens is people mistake the Jesus in the book for what people are talking about when they talk about the historical Jesus. So they look for the evidence that they would expect to see of the book rather than the actual person.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So why don't we talk about some issues we see with the way skepticism is done in the skeptical community, some problems we see. One in particular that I see regularly is this idea that doubting is the only thing, the only part, like just denying claims is the only part of skepticism. And it seems like people don't do the next step of investigating them. And if the evidence is good, accepting them, because, accepting good claims is also part of it.
Yes, that's it. It's, and I think that is a big problem in the skeptic community. It's basically, show me evidence. A popular one
I don't
is,
like your evidence.
Yeah. It's show me evidence and I'll change my mind. And then you show them evidence and it's like, well, I don't count that as evidence. That's a big problem.
No, show me evidence that says I'm right.
Yeah. Basically, that happens a hell of a lot, unfortunately. Right. And that is definitely bad skepticism. And this goes back to what I was saying. Being a good skeptic is also about understanding the kind of evidence you're looking for. And the kind of evidence that actually suits the claim you're looking for. Like, I know this is it's kind of a big one. You can't prove a negative, That's quite a big claim in the skeptic community. But it just takes 2 seconds to actually search and say, can you prove a negative? And you'll find a bunch of information that will show you that there are negatives that can be proven. So they're not
particularly since like any positive claim you wanted to that you've proved, you could just rephrase it as a negative claim.
Yeah. So when you show them this evidence, there's a lot of skeptics who will dig down further then and just say, well, no, you can't prove a negative. Okay, but here's the evidence you can. Yeah, but you can't prove a negative. And it kind of gets stuck in that loop. Yeah.
It's like dogmatic is really what it is.
Yeah.
I think too, like sometimes I automatically assume if I'm speaking with other atheists that they're skeptics, and just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're a skeptic.
Just because you say you're a skeptic doesn't mean you're a skeptic.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, I've come to see people who have #skeptic in their name as not particularly good skeptics. It's like a band t-shirt more than an actual disposition.
Yeah, for sure. And there definitely seems to be a correlation with how loudly they proclaim how much they want evidence. Like that's inversely proportional to how readily they'll actually accept evidence.
Yeah. And there is something called epistemic humility. I don't know if you've heard that. But basically being a skeptic is more than just asking these questions. It's about making it part of a disposition of ourselves. So when we come across something that we don't know, or we come across somebody that challenges what we know, rather than just going, nope, I'm right, we should have a little bit of humility about what we know. Well, the person in front of us could know more than we actually know. I mean, I still do it. I've got degrees in this stuff, but I'll come across people who will tell me I'm getting it wrong. And even though I know nothing about them, I'll be like, well, okay, maybe they know more than I do. You just have to have that little bit of humility. You go and look it up. That's being a better skeptic. Epistemic humility is the most important first step to being a good skeptic.
Really accepting that you could be wrong.
Yeah.
And trying to look for ways in which trying to find ways in which you're wrong.
Yeah.
You know, working just as hard to prove yourself wrong as you do to prove yourself right.
Exactly. And a lot of skeptics today like to talk about the scientific method, and they go on about the null hypothesis, and all the language revolves around it. But that's a big part of science. It's not going out and proving your theory right. It's going, how can I show my theory is wrong? And that's part of being a good skeptic in day-to-day life as well.
Seems to be a distinction too, because like when people find out that I'm a skeptic, they don't really understand what that means. They assume that I'm a cynic.
Yes.
You know, and then
yes.
So.
And I think that's the case, because when you go online, you find that a lot. And this goes back to what we were just saying about not knowing what evidence to look for, or being shown evidence and going, nah, that's not evidence. That is just being cynical. It's going, well, I'm right, and you must be wrong because you're saying something that disagrees with what I think. So therefore, whatever you're showing me must be wrong.
Well, so we've mentioned evidence a couple times, and obviously that's a very important part of being a skeptic. So what is evidence? Like, what should we be looking for when looking for good evidence?
Okay, well, I go with a pretty simple kind of definition of evidence, and this seems to work across the board because you get a lot of people who will argue that evidence only comes in empirical form. But I'm quite happy to.
Where's your evidence of that?
Yeah, that's it. It goes back to the sort of logical positivism. The only thing that has any meaning is when it can be pointed to something that actually exists. It's like, well, then that statement is meaningless.
Right.
And that's the same with that kind of evidence. If evidence is only empirical, you can't evidence that claim that evidence is only empirical. So I generally go with the idea is evidence is anything that raises or lowers the probability of a claim or proposition being true. So you can have evidence that it's false, and that lowers the probability, or evidence that it's true. And the thing with that as well is there's evidence that can point to several different outcomes, like an underdetermined theory. So it's whichever one it raises the probability the most of for me.
Yeah, certainly a piece of evidence could support multiple models. Doesn't necessarily it might support this subclass of models, but not these other ones, and that would still be evidence for this group. And also, it's important to remember that something being evidence doesn't mean that its existence means a thing is certain now. Like it doesn't have to. This piece of evidence doesn't have to prove it on its own.
No. Evidence is a body of things. Like there's a lot of people. You get a lot of theists online who will say, what is your best evidence for atheism? Well, I don't have a particular piece of evidence. It's a cumulative thing. It's a body of things that points me towards this being true rather than that.
Right. The same Christians will have no problem giving the cumulative case for resurrection, though. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
but then on the other side, you'll get a Christian saying, here's an argument for theism, like the Kalam cosmological argument is a good example of this. Yeah. And the objection you hear a lot is, well, that doesn't prove God exists. Well, they didn't say it did. Or it's hopefully they didn't say it did. Like that doesn't, but the thing could still be evidence for theism if it increases its probability, even if it doesn't get you all the way there.
Exactly. It points towards the idea that there is a first cause. And that doesn't sift out naturalism and it doesn't sift out theism, but it does point towards the idea that spontaneous combustion didn't form the universe.
Right. Yeah. So if you accepted the Kalam, that wouldn't necessarily mean you have to accept theism, but it does mean that the probability of any first cause has gone up.
Yeah, that's it. That's all it is.
So what other things should we be looking at when we're talking about evidence? Another thing I hear all the time is arguments from authority. That's another favorite of the skeptic community. Yeah,
I wish they would stop doing that. Most scientists say this is true. Well, that's an argument from authority. No, it's not. That's just, these people are experts. They probably know what they're talking about. So let's go with what they say. Doesn't mean it's true, but it means it's more likely to be true than your plumber going, well, you know what? I think that bloke down the street shouldn't be wearing a mask.
Right. And I think that kind of touches on a key point of this kind of absolutist mindset that some skeptics have, that if this thing isn't definitive, it's not 100% reliable, therefore it's 0% reliable, right?
Yes.
If experts can ever be wrong, then we can't rely on them for anything.
Yeah. And this kind of goes back to, we were talking about you can't prove a negative earlier. I've had people argue that. Well, one that we had recently was evidence of absence is an absence of evidence. And we gave the example of, opening your fridge door and there being no cheese. That proves the negative that there's cheese in your fridge. Or, there's no cheese in your fridge. And he was like, well, you can doubt that. Okay, well, how do you doubt that there's cheese in the fridge? Well, it could be behind a bottle. Okay, you move the bottle. Now there's no cheese in the fridge. Well, no. And this was the actual argument that they gave. There could be a secret compartment put in the fridge by the manufacturer that they put a piece of cheese in. And you're like, what now? And he goes, well, if you can doubt it, that means you haven't proved the negative. It's like, well, no, you don't want that kind of certainty for anything. Nothing is that certain. Science certainly isn't that certain.
Yeah, that's when I pull out my Sawzall and cut that fridge up. So,
but then there could be secret stealth cheese.
It could be that you've just not cut it down small enough. Exactly. It could be a crumb of cheese. But there's a look. Sorry,
and like you said, they don't tend to hold that kind of standard for everything. Just the things that they don't want.
That's it. Yeah, and that's another sign of not being a particularly good skeptic. Something I like to say is if you wouldn't accept your claim coming from somebody else, like if you're an atheist and a theist was to make the same argument to you and you would reject that same argument, you're probably not being a very good skeptic. If that makes sense.
For sure.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. So back on the argument from authority, though, because we're talking about evidence and
sorry, I'm ADHD brain.
That's cool. So it's interesting to me that often you'll get like that you can't use them. That's an argument from authority. And then in the same breath, you'll get, so here's this other authority that I like.
Yes.
You hear this all the time with mythicists, since we talked about them earlier. Like, you can't trust biblical scholars. Yeah, that's an argument from authority. Bring them up. So anyway, here's Richard Carrier's book. You should believe everything in there.
Yes. Another popular one is, and I get this a lot with the definition of atheism. Here's philosophy. Here's how they define it. Well, philosophy is an authority. It's not an authority on how I use the word, and that's an argument from authority. Aaron Ross says atheism is X, so therefore that's what it is.
Well, if Aaron Ross says it, then must be true.
It must be true, yeah. But like you say, there seems to be this double standard where it's if you present something, a lot of people are just looking to dismiss arguments, and like they're not even using the fallacies correctly to dismiss them. And that's another sign of being a bad skeptic. If you're just yelling out fallacies to look to dismiss an argument and you can't actually explain the problem with the argument, you're not being a particularly good skeptic. You're just looking for reasons to deny people who think differently to you.
Then you're committing my favorite fallacy, the fallacy
fallacy.
Which, if anybody hasn't heard of that before, it's where you say because an argument is fallacious, its conclusion is false, which of course is false. You could have a fallacious argument that accidentally has a true conclusion, you know?
Yeah. Especially when it's like an informal fallacy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't want to play fallacy bingo is what we often call it, where you're just like, oh, you made a mistake, therefore I can ignore everything you said.
Yeah, that happens to me a lot, to be honest. Like, people do it to me a lot.
Yeah. I was just thinking of this, like, it seems like sometimes skeptics aren't really out to find truth. Do you think that you have to be looking for truth to be a skeptic, or can you just be in that perennial sense, like, I don't believe it, like, nothing's knowable?
I think even in some sense, the Pyrrhonians were looking for truth. It's just they realized because of the, say, Agrippa's trilemma, which is, everything leads to an infinite regress. Everything is dogmatically asserted, or everything is circular. Because of that, they thought truth couldn't be had. And that meant that searching for truth becomes difficult. So I think that even then they were still looking for truth. They just couldn't figure out how to get it. And I think you do have to be looking for truth to be a good skeptic. And it's one thing that Matt Dillahunty says that I actually kind of like. What is it? I want to believe as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible. I think that is like a good skeptic motto.
Yeah, I love that motto, and I would say it a lot more if it weren't repeated by people who are bad skeptics.
Yes. And it's sort of become a dogma where it's repeated as like a secret handshake into the club rather than any actual guiding principle.
Right.
So you made a good point, though, about the guiding principle, because I think sometimes we lose or we never even gain that idea of having a guiding principle, like whether you've deconverted and that's how you found your way into skepticism or through some other means, until you really understand, like, what is that guiding principle that's causing you to question things and causing you to look for truth. It can, if you don't have that compass pointing you in the right direction, it can definitely make you go off the path. And I think that's what we see a lot of times in the skeptic community.
Yeah, absolutely agree. When people come out of their theism, they generally end up, or I argue, they generally end up on YouTube, and they generally end up down the atheist experience pipeline, which is they end up looking at Matt Dillahunty or Ron Ra, Seth Andrews, people like that. And those people are arming them with arguments and sending them out there to combat theism, or combat Christianity mostly, rather than saying, okay, welcome to skepticism. Here's some guiding principles. Here's some ways to go about it. Here's some ways to look at your beliefs. It's not about the skepticism. It's about sending you out to combat Christianity. Yeah, and it's understandable to some degree in certain states in America, but it doesn't make for good skeptics.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of emphasis on the us versus them. Like a lot of people want the label of being a skeptic without doing the work of being skeptical, right?
Yes.
And I think you can see that in the mindset that a lot of atheists have is that atheist equals skeptic. You know, if you are an atheist, you must be a skeptic. And if you're a skeptic, you must be an atheist. Like those are like the two things. When it seems to me, if we've defined a skeptic as someone who has a kind of doubting mindset about claims and looks for good evidence before they accept that something is true, I think that's a good baseline for skepticism. Then there's nothing stopping someone who's a Christian from being a skeptic. They accept claims that I personally wouldn't accept, but as long as they've done their due diligence to investigate the claim and have, tried their best to come to good conclusions based on the evidence, then great. I think they're wrong, but it doesn't make them not a skeptic. A lot of people disagree with me.
Yeah. I mean, I disagree with myself most of the time. That's what philosophy does to you. But yeah, no, I completely agree. You've even got skeptical theism.
Sure.
It's a very different thing to actually being a skeptic. Skeptical theism is terrible, but there are skeptics that are theists. They've gone into it. I think we have this habit of, well, if you come to a different conclusion to me, you've not been skeptical.
Or you're unreasonable or irrational or
irrational,
whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
No true skeptic fallacy.
Yes. Let's coin it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But yeah, I think as long as you're actually doing your due diligence, and I think what a lot of people seem to forget is that we all have our own epistemic bubbles. We all only have access to the information that we have access to. And our childhood thoughts will guide our adulthood thoughts as well. We have grounded beliefs and everything, like Descartes, everything's kind of comes up from them. So that will all influence everything. So you can still doubt what you had as a child and what you got into as an adult and still come to the same conclusions.
You brought up the word doubt there, Dave, and so it's no coincidence that our channel's name is Reasons to Doubt, but I think they just see that and then the rest of it, which goes into the skeptical method. But what is your opinion on doubt and how do you approach doubt just in general? Because it's kind of related to skepticism, I think.
Oh, it definitely is. I think doubt is a good thing. Doubting everything is a bad thing. And I think there's a tendency in the skeptic community to say, well, I doubt everything unless I'm presented with evidence. But once you actually get into the weeds, people don't. They don't doubt that they're going to get hit by a car when they go down to the bottom of the stairs. Or they don't think that Mark's going to jump out of the toilet. Doubt is a good thing. And as Hume would put it, we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. I think that is basically doubt. There are certain things that we can just accept without doubting too much. Generally, when we ask somebody on the street, have you got the time? Going back to before we all had mobile phones anyway. We wouldn't doubt that they were telling us the correct time. We wouldn't go, well, can you show me the evidence that you're showing me the correct time?
Prove that your watch is accurate.
Yeah. Most people don't do that kind of thing. And a lot of people only doubt claims that they already doubt.
Well, and I think go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that's another thing to do with skepticism. It's not just doubting. It's not just questioning other people's beliefs. It's, questioning our own and where we got them from, like we mentioned earlier.
I'd say for stuff like that, though, it's not even that you're not doubting. The people who say, well, I doubt that that's true, I would require evidence for the guy's watch or whatever, they're ignoring all of the background evidence that they have, like the background knowledge, which is it's an important piece. Like, it's not that I've just accepted on faith that a car isn't going to plow through my living room. I have a lot of background knowledge that tells me it's unlikely to happen. And therefore, based on the evidence I have, like background knowledge is evidence.
It is evidence in and of itself. Yeah. And that's why Bayesian goes into prior probabilities a lot.
Yeah.
We've dropped the ball 100 times and it's fallen 100 times. So that raises the probability that the ball is it's not that each time we drop a ball, we're coming into a new instance of a ball dropping.
Exactly. And that kind of ties into what we were talking about with authorities. It's, you're raising the likelihood that this is true. We have a lot of prior experience with dealing with the scientific consensus or the medical community or whatever, and they're usually right. But we also have the prior knowledge that science changes over time. So we should accept what they have because it's usually right, with the understanding that in the future that could change.
Yeah.
Though I will say, just as an aside on science, because some creationists like to look at, science changes, therefore it's unreliable. But this is a little bit off topic, but they have a incorrect concept of how science changes. Science doesn't go here to here to here, like it's all over randomly. It's getting progressively less wrong over time as they narrow in on the correct answer.
To an actual answer, yeah. There's paradigm shifts, but that doesn't mean that once that paradigm shifts, all the information that was had before is now useless. It just means we're looking at it a slightly different way.
All of the observations, the evidence that led you to this conclusion is still there. And so any new model must have the same predictions for the same evidence because that's the evidence,
Yeah.
That's like relativity, doesn't predict different things than Newtonian physics when it doesn't predict that the ball's not going to drop because that would be insane,
That's it. Yeah. It's not. It doesn't overwrite everything. Yeah. Like people say, evolution could be disproven tomorrow. Well, no. Certain bits of it could be. But the majority of the theory is going to remain the same.
I mean, you could say maybe, but any new theory you come up with is going to have to make the same predictions.
It's going to be rooted in it. And yeah.
So I suppose you could prove that the mechanisms we think drive evolution are incorrect, perhaps, but what this new mechanism you're coming up with must be the same as the old mechanism in these circumstances because it made accurate predictions.
That's it. And I think that's one of the things about science. One of the good things is we were talking about evidence earlier, and I jump all over the place, ADHD brain, like I say. What evidence, testable predictions is a good thing that is evidence. If your theory can actually make a prediction about something and that prediction happens, even just 99.9% of the time, that's pretty good evidence that whatever you're arguing is correct.
Yeah. One thing on doubt that, getting back to the black and white thing, it seems like there's a problem not just in humans in general, and the skeptic community is not immune to this, to being uncomfortable with I don't know, preferring any answer to no answer at all.
Yeah.
So one thing I wish that skeptics in particular would be better at is being not just saying that I don't know is okay, because they'll often say that, but no, genuinely, I don't know is an okay answer,
Yes. Again, that goes back to the bad skepticism where you can present people with evidence and they'll go, that's wrong. Because, like you said, the whole it's okay to say I don't know thing is just performative. And it would be good. That's a good sign of epistemic humility, actually being able to say, okay, well, maybe I didn't know. When presented with something new, that ability to say maybe I didn't know or maybe I don't know is a foundation for being able to change your mind.
I wonder too. So I have if I say I don't know, there's something deep inside of me that goes, oh, now you have to find out. It drives me to find that answer. But I wonder if just some people are just they're literally okay with saying I don't know, and they don't care if they find the answer. If there's something,
I suffer from that with certain things.
With certain topics.
It's I don't know, and I really just don't care.
For sure.
Sadly, some of theism is like that for me. I didn't grow up in it. I don't really care whether it's true or not. Jesus mythicism is another one. I don't think it's true. I generally tend to go with the historical evidence, but I don't really care that much.
I'm that way with biology. I try to care because, I'm trying to combat creationism and other things like that. So like I have a reason to care about it, but man, is it hard for me to like keep my eyes open. As like the instant someone starts talking biology, my brain starts to like just
I'll just practice the biology of sleeping.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we've talked about what it means to be a skeptic. We've talked about the ways that you should go about being a skeptic, requiring evidence for your beliefs, but then when you get evidence, accepting it. Signs of being a good skeptic being that you change your mind sometimes. That's probably a good sign that if you have the same thoughts 10 years from now as you did today, you probably haven't done much skepticism along the way.
You've done a Descartes.
Right, exactly. You've done it there. We're going to use that term now. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the skeptical audience, last message to give to them?
Pick up a book on critical thinking. Like, not just say I'm a critical thinker, but actually pick up a book on critical thinking. Because critical thinking is harder than many people seem to think. A lot of people think critical thinking is being cynical, but critical thinking isn't just going, nah, it's an actual process. And I released a video recently that talked about the schematic processing that we have and how we have what are known as our event schemas. And what these are sort of scripts in our head that play out whenever we encounter a particular situation. And critical thinking is about changing those event schemas so that when we approach a particular situation, it becomes a disposition and we start to think critically. Thinking critically is about looking at both sides, and skepticism is sort of the same thing. It's not about just looking at what's wrong with a particular argument, but what's right about a particular argument. And I think that's a big thing that gets lost in the skeptic community, forgetting to look about what's right about the argument. As if you admit to anything being right at all, it means you must accept it. But that's not quite the case.
Or that you've lost something.
Yeah. The debate bro thing has killed the skeptic community, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. You should be, if you really understand a position, you should be able to articulate it and the things in favor of it well, right? Because even the worst, maybe not the worst, but a lot of even bad propositions aren't completely hopeless. They have something going for them, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I kind of like to promote Cartesian skepticism. It sets the bar way too high. I don't think anybody can actually succeed in doing. But there's a lot we as skeptics can learn from it. The methodological doubt, going through our beliefs, especially the most important ones, and questioning them all. That even bad ideas can have good things found within them that are useful to us.
I wish that the skeptic community would quit with this anti-philosophy thing they've got going on. There seems to be a push where like all of philosophy is useless and philosophers it's a waste of time. And I mean, don't get me wrong, some forms of philosophy are really in the weeds and noodly and, kind of,
I mean,
blow my mind.
Books here and degrees, and I'll absolutely agree with you. There's philosophy that's crap.
But what it seems that when people who are like, oh, philosophy is a waste of time, I don't deal with it, it doesn't stop them from doing philosophy. They just do it badly.
If you're calling yourself a skeptic, you're doing philosophy. Philosophy is epistemological. Yeah. Skepticism is epistemological. It's part of philosophy. It's part of the theory of knowledge. So if you're dismissing it out of hand, this goes back to the whole, being a bad skeptic thing.
And if you want to know about history, you should talk to a historian. If you want to know about physics, you should talk to a physicist. If you want to know about philosophy, you should talk to a philosopher, right?
Yeah. If you want to know about epistemology, go to the epistemologist.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. Well, Dave, where can people find you on the internets if they want to hear more?
I have my own YouTube channel called Trolley Dave, and you can also find me with Joe on Answers in Reason. We probably will be going back to streaming soon. I know Joe wants to, so I'll probably be joining him. like I say, I've just had a couple of health issues that has kept me from doing it for a while.
Awesome. Well, I concur with what Jared said earlier. Strongly recommend that everyone check out their channel. I know it helped me immensely as a skeptic. I learned a lot from having watched them. They pulled me out of the agnostic atheist sinkhole. And
yeah, we're bad for that.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Jared?
No, I was just going to ask Dave. So normally we wrap up with the fallacy of the day. That's kind of our thing. We already touched on the fallacy, but is there a particular fallacy that you enjoy the most?
Or is misused the most?
Or is misused? Yeah. What's your take?
Ooh. Okay, that's a difficult one. I'll go with my favorite one, because this one is actually really relevant to the skeptic community, and it sort of links into Jared's Jordan's fallacy. This is the G.I. Joe fallacy, and it's based off knowing is only half the thing.
Knowledge is half the battle.
Knowledge is half the battle, yeah. It's a lot of people seem to believe, and like this leads to the fallacy bingo, a lot of people seem to believe that if you know the name of a fallacy, you have overcome you committing that fallacy, when actually all you've been able to do is name the fallacy, and most of the times name it incorrectly. So that's my favorite one, because I see that a lot in the skeptic community.
The G.I. Joe fallacy, I like that. So the way you can avoid that is by not just like shouting a fallacy and running away. What you should do instead is say, hey, you argued in this way. You might say this is called that fallacy, and here's why that's wrong. Here's why I think that's the case.
Yes,
that would do a couple things. It would, one, teach the other person what they did wrong, rather than just screaming a word at them and running. And also, maybe you're wrong about the fallacy, and if you talk about it, maybe you'll find out that you were wrong. And that's good. Because then the best part about being a skeptic is if you find out you're wrong, you can just change your mind, and then you're not wrong anymore. Boom.
Yeah.
I'm solved.
And that's pushed a lot in the skeptic community. It'd be nice to actually see it happening a little more.
Yeah, as much as they yell about being skeptics, they sure don't seem to change their mind a whole lot.
Yeah, I tend to call it aesthetic skepticism. It's all about how it looks.
Yeah.
Skepticism. I'll have to come up with a word for that. But
Once you do, let me know and I'll start using it.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Dave. It was a blast, and hopefully we can have you on again.
Yeah, no, anytime. Thanks for having me on. I'm honored. It was a lot of fun.
And until then, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.
Peace out.